The dog shouldn't have known where to go. That was the first thing that snagged in Thomas's mind, a splinter of wrongness he couldn't pull free. The stray's limp was bad, a ragged, dragging wound on its hind leg that should have sent it crawling for scraps in the darkest alleys of Copper Ridge. But it didn't. This dog walked down the center of the dusty main street like it owned the ground beneath its paws. No hesitation, no circling for a dropped crust of bread. It moved with a purpose that felt ancient, as if the root was burned into its very bones. Thomas, a boy of 12 made old by hunger, watched from the shadows. He was used to being invisible. An orphan hiding behind the general store's barrels was just another piece of the town's decay, easy to ignore. But he couldn't ignore this. Then came the second strange thing. The dog didn't stop at the butcher's. It didn't stop at the saloon where men sometimes threw out bones. It stopped at the Morrison cabin, a place whispered about in hushed tones, a place sealed by fear for more than a decade. The Morrisons had vanished one winter, leaving behind nothing but a cold hearth and a story that curdled the blood. No one went near it. The dog ignored the ghost stories. It limped onto the porch, scratched the door 3 times, a sharp, deliberate rap, 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 then sat back on its haunches and waited, as if it was expecting an answer. Thomas crept closer, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He saw the door frame, and the breath caught in his throat. There were fresh carvings in the wood, recent marks. Someone had been here. Someone knew the cabin wasn't empty. And whatever they were looking for, the dog had just led him right to their doorstep. Thomas Talbot was a creature of hunger. His shirt was a web of holes held together by threads of memory. He crouched behind those barrels and watched life happen through a pane of dusty glass. He saw mothers buying flour, fathers hefting precious jars of water, things he could only dream of. His stomach wasn't just empty, it was a hollow ache that echoed through his whole body. In Copper Ridge, being an orphan meant you were a ghost at the feast. But the drought had turned the whole town into a ghost. 4 months without a drop of rain. The earth was cracked and angry. The town well, once a source of pride, was now a source of fear, its water level dropping by the day. Worry was a mask worn by every face. Eyes scanned the mercilessly blue sky, prayers dying on chapped lips. The marshal had ordered rationing, a few cups a day. No exceptions. Except there were always exceptions. Rich families had barrels hidden in their cellars. Their livestock drank deep while the children of poorer folk fainted in the heat. Injustice was a shimmer in the air, thick as the dust itself. And in the middle of it all was Thomas, a boy with no family, no land, not even a clean drink of water to call his own. Fate, it turned out, arrived on 4 limping legs. The dog strode down the street, and it was like watching a king return to his kingdom. It ignored the stones boys threw. It ignored the shouted curses. Most strays knew the rules. Stick to the alleys, stay invisible. This one broke all the rules. It walked with a certainty that called to the emptiness in Thomas's own gut. Hunger knows hunger. Exile knows its own. Without even thinking, he rose from his hiding place. He started to follow. He kept his distance, a shadow tracking a shadow. The dog never looked back. It didn't need to. It knew the way. It passed the church, its steeple split by a crack, like a frozen bolt of lightning. It passed the schoolhouse, where a teacher had once told him that orphans were a trouble the drought couldn't afford. It led him past the last of the neat fences, beyond the edge of town where civilization gave up, and the wild scrub began. The wind made a dry, whispering sound in the grass. Empty corrals leaned like skeletons. This was the blank part of the map, the part of the world dotted with failed homesteads and dry wells. But the dog's limp was steady. Its path was sure. This wasn't wandering. This was a pilgrimage. Thomas's curiosity hardened into something else, something like hope. Whatever this animal was walking toward, maybe it had something for a boy with nothing left to lose. He matched his pace to the dog's rhythm. And when the hills opened up to reveal the solitary, hunched shape of the Morrison cabin, half swallowed by weeds, he didn't even slow down. The cabin was a scar on the hillside. Folks in Copper Ridge told stories about it to scare their children. They said the whole Morrison family had been erased by the winter wind, leaving nothing behind. It was a place you dared your friends to look at, not a place you walked toward. But as Thomas stood there, ribs tight with a mix of fear and hunger, he saw that the stories were wrong. The door wasn't swollen shut. It wasn't sealed by a decade of neglect. It was ajar. A thin, sharp line of shadow proved it. Someone had passed through it, and they had done it recently. The proof was in the dust. Fresh boot prints, stamped deep and clear. Not the shuffling tracks of a vagrant, but the confident strides of someone who wasn't afraid of being seen. They pointed right at the entrance. Thomas looked up at the doorknob. It was brass and it gleamed in the afternoon sun. It shouldn't have gleamed. It should have been tarnished and green. But there were polished spots on it, marks where a hand had turned it, again and again. He reached out, his fingers trembling, but he didn't even need to touch it. The dog nudged the door with its nose, and it swung open. It didn't creak like a rotten thing. It swung with a smooth, oiled groan, the sound of a hinge that was maintained, cared for, used. Thomas's mouth went dry. This cabin wasn't abandoned. It wasn't cursed. It was a secret, and the dog had just brought him right inside. The air in the cabin was thick with the smell of dust, dry wood, and something else, something sharp and metallic. Thomas had expected cobwebs. He had expected rot. He found a workshop. A heavy wooden table stood in the middle of the room. It wasn't decayed. It was scarred with the marks of recent work, and it was covered in maps. Dozens of them, inked with a precise, steady hand. They weren't simple drawings of the countryside. They were geological surveys. Cross-sections of the earth itself, showing layers of rock and ancient fault lines. Thomas traced a finger over one. The detail was incredible. Whoever drew these knew the ground beneath Copper Ridge better than most people knew their own faces. Next to the maps were tools, jagged teeth from drill bits, pieces of specialized mining equipment. And along the edge of the table, lined up like soldiers, were small glass vials. Each one was stoppered and filled with a sample. Clay, shale, sandstone, each one labeled with neat handwriting, marked with dates and coordinates. This wasn't a hideout. It was a laboratory. Then his eyes landed on one map that was different from the rest. A bold trail of red ink cut across the paper. It started at the cabin and snaked its way 2 miles northwest. At the end of the trail, a large X was circled, and next to it, in blocky capital letters, were 4 words: primary source. 40F down. Pure. His pulse hammered in his ears. Pure what? Not gold, not copper. In a town dying of thirst, those words could only mean one thing: water. But it was what he found beneath the maps that made his blood run cold. A folded letter. The paper was crisp, the ink was fresh. It was dated only 3 days ago. It was addressed to the buyer, and it was signed with a name that made Thomas's stomach clench into a knot of ice. Silas Crow, the wealthiest merchant in Copper Ridge, the man who had been buying up failing farms for pennies on the dollar, pretending it was charity. The letter laid the truth bare. It spoke of favorable prices and maintaining discretion. It said to wait until all parcels are secured before revealing the true value of the land. Thomas's hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold the paper. The dog hadn't led him to a ghost story. It had led him into the dark heart of a conspiracy that was about to bleed his entire town dry. The letter was a death sentence written in calm, neat script. Silas Crow, the man who smiled at children and handed out hard candy, knew. He knew about the water. An entire underground river, a hidden aquifer big enough to last 100 years. He'd had it mapped, surveyed, and measured, and he had said nothing. The plan was as simple as it was vicious. Let the drought do its work. Let the wells run dry. Let the people grow desperate, buy their land when they're broken, buy their futures for a handful of coins. Then, and only then, reveal the miracle. Unveil the water and sell it back to the very people you just bankrupted. At whatever price you choose. Every piece of evidence on the table screamed the truth. The soil samples catalogued by depth, the coordinates circled in red, a ledger with a column labeled Disbursements to Surveyor. The science of salvation had been twisted into a weapon of greed. The drought wasn't a tragedy. It was an opportunity. Thomas felt a bitter taste in his mouth, a mix of dust and fury. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a carefully designed execution. Suddenly the dog's ears twitched. A low growl rumbled in its chest, a vibration Thomas felt through the floorboards. It was a warning, delivered a split second before his own senses registered the sound. The crunch of boots on dry brush outside. Voices, low and confident. The voices of men who didn't expect to find a locked door. Thomas folded the letter, his fingers clumsy. He shoved it deep into his ragged shirt. He glanced at the map one last time. The red line. The X. 40 feet down. He could run. He could try to tell someone. But who would believe an orphan boy over Silas Crow? The latch on the door clicked. It was lifting. The dog went perfectly still. Thomas held his breath, his world shrinking to the sound of that single, metallic click. His hands shook, the damning letter a hot secret against his skin. The dog didn't bark. It didn't growl. It moved. It padded with a strange urgency toward the far corner of the cabin, to a section of the floor where the wooden planks looked newer than the rest. Its paw scratched once, twice, and Thomas saw it, the edge of a board that wasn't nailed down. His fingers were numb with fear, but he pried at the edge. It lifted easily, revealing a shallow, dark space beneath the cabin. Dust puffed up, choking him, but there was just enough room. He slid into the darkness, the dog right behind him. He pulled the plank back into place just as the heavy tread of boots hit the porch. The door groaned open. A slice of light cut across the floorboards just inches above his face. Thomas pressed his cheek to the cool, packed earth, his heart hammering a rhythm so loud he was sure they would hear it. Crow's voice sliced through the silence, calm, commanding. "Is everything still here?" Another man's voice answered. The scuff of his boots was a heavy, threatening sound. "Maps are untouched, samples all accounted for." The vibration of their steps shook loose dirt from the floorboards, raining it down on Thomas's hair. He risked a glance through a tiny crack between the planks. He saw expensive leather boots, polished even in the dust of a dying town. They paced back and forth, back and forth. Crow's voice shifted, turning colder, more calculating. "Another month, maybe less. Thirst will break the last of them. The Johnsons lost their cattle. The Whitmores are about to fold." He paused right over Thomas's hiding spot. "Once we have the last holdout, then we discover the water. Pure, abundant, a miracle." A low chuckle followed. "By then, every acre worth a dam will belong to me." White-hot anger rose in Thomas's chest. He thought of Mrs. Johnson, her face a mask of grief. He thought of the Whitmore children, their eyes dull with thirst. They weren't people to Silas Crow. They were just obstacles. The dog pressed closer, a warm, solid weight in the terrifying dark. Crow wasn't just a greedy merchant. He was a predator. And this drought was his hunting ground. If Thomas didn't get out of here, if he didn't find a way to warn them, Copper Ridge wouldn't just be bought. It would be devoured. He pressed his palms flat against the earth, forcing himself to breathe, to stay silent. The dog was a statue beside him, ears pinned back, listening. Above them, the clink of spurs against wood. A new voice entered the conversation. It was rough. It was familiar. And it was filled with an authority that made Thomas's blood freeze in his veins. Marshal Dixon, the lawman, the man sworn to protect Copper Ridge. He was in on it. "Got word from the Johnsons this morning," Dixon drawled. His boots traced slow, lazy circles on the floor above. "They've lost their last cow. Wife's been crying for 3 days straight. They'll take whatever price you offer." His words weren't filled with pity. They were filled with satisfaction. A family's ruin was just a good business deal. Silas Crow grunted, pleased. Papers rustled on the table. Thomas could picture them, 2 vultures hunched over their map of a dying town. "Good," Crow said. "That makes 7 properties, 4 or 5 more, and the whole basin is ours. Then we unveil the miracle. By the time anyone figures it out, we'll own every last drop of water." Dixon let out a low, ugly chuckle. "Desperation's the best leverage there is. They'll be crawling to you on their knees before long. The Petersons will break next, then the Whitmores. They just don't know it yet." In the darkness, Thomas clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached. He pictured the faces in town, gaunt and tired. He pictured mothers measuring out muddy water by the spoonful. And above him, these men were placing bets on who would suffer most. Then it happened. Dixon took a heavy step, stomping his boot down right near their corner. A faint tremor shook the floorboards. A thin veil of dust sifted down, landing on Thomas's hair, on the dog's muzzle. The dog let out a tiny, stifled sneeze. A small sound, almost nothing. But in the tense silence of that cabin, it was as loud as a gunshot. Thomas's blood turned to ice. The boots above stopped moving. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy. Marshal Dixon's voice was sharp now, suspicious. "What about the boy?" he asked. "That Talbot, Orphan. Been seen nosing around today. Folks say he followed some stray dog up this way." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Silas Crow's polished boots took 2 slow steps. They stopped directly over the loose floorboard. For one terrifying heartbeat, Thomas felt the man's physical weight pressing down, squeezing the air from his lungs. "If that kid has been in here," Crow said, his voice a low, cold whisper, "then we have a problem." Dixon's spurs jingled. "A problem with a simple solution," the marshal replied. "If he's seen those maps, if he knows about the water, he doesn't leave this mountain alive." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. His throat closed up. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The dog beside him let out the faintest whimper, and Thomas clamped a hand over its muzzle, praying the sound hadn't carried. But it was too late. "Search everywhere," Crow commanded, his voice calm and deadly. "Under the bed, behind the crates. Rip up the floor if you have to." He paused. "If that boy is here, you drag him out, and you end it." Thomas heard the sickening splinter of wood as Crow used a crowbar to pry up the first board at the far end of the room. The sound echoed in the small space. It was the ticking of a clock counting down the last seconds of his life. Dust and splinters rained down into the crawl space as they began to tear the cabin apart, board by board. With every sharp crack of wood, death crept closer. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut, his fists clenched in the dirt. He was trapped. There was no way out. Crow's hands would be on him in minutes, and the last hope for Copper Ridge would be buried in the dark, right alongside him. As the sound of splintering wood grew closer, a faint glint of light caught Thomas's eye. It came from the dog's neck, a battered leather collar almost hidden in the fur, and on it a small tarnished metal tag. He leaned closer, his eyes straining in the dim light filtering through the cracks. Words were scratched into the metal, faded, but still there. Property of J. Morrison, surveyor. The breath left Thomas's body in a silent rush. Joe Morrison, the man from the ghost stories, the man hired by the town council all those years ago to find new water sources, the man who had vanished. It all clicked into place. A series of terrible, perfect connections. This dog wasn't a stray. This was Morrison's dog. It was the only living witness to what happened in this cabin, the only one who knew the truth of Morrison's work and his disappearance. That's why it walked with such purpose. It wasn't wandering. It was coming home. It was retracing the steps it had taken 100 times with its master. The dog hadn't just led him to a secret. It had led him to the secret Joe Morrison died to protect. Above, Crow grunted with effort. "He's not over here." The sound of boots stomped closer. He was starting on the next row of boards. He was only feet away. The boy's body was rigid with terror, his palms sweating against the cold dirt. The dog beside him shifted. Its ears twitched as if listening to something only it could hear. Then it made its move. It let out a sharp, sudden whine. But the sound didn't come from their corner. Somehow the animal threw the sound across the small space. It echoed from the farthest, darkest shadows of the cabin, a perfect ventriloquist's trick. Crow froze. Then he snarled. "Got you now, you little rat!" He spun on his heel, his boots thundering overhead, as he charged toward the opposite side of the room, abandoning his careful search. He was sure he had his prey cornered. Thomas stared in disbelief. The dog had deliberately created a diversion. It had faked their location. It was an impossible, desperate gamble, and it had worked. For the first time since crawling into this hole, Thomas felt a tiny flicker of hope. He had a few seconds. Maybe it was enough. But before Crow could rip up a single board on the other side, a new sound cut through the air. A sound that wasn't wood splintering or boots scraping. It came from outside, voices, lots of them, angry and urgent, the unmistakable sound of a crowd marching up the hill. Crow stopped dead. "What in the hell is that?" he muttered. Through the cracks, Thomas could hear them clearly now. Dozens of people, armed. And then a single voice rose above the others, sharp with outrage and authority. "Silas Crow! Dixon! We know you're in there!" Thomas's heart leaped. He knew that voice. It was Clara Whitmore, one of the toughest ranchers in the valley. And she hadn't come alone. She'd brought half the town with her. Panic erupted above. Bootsteps scrambled across the floor. Papers were swept off the table. Glass vials clinked as they were shoved into saddlebags. They were destroying the evidence. "The back door!" Crow barked. "We'll lose them in the hills." Thomas pressed closer to the dog. The animal just looked up at him, its eyes calm and intelligent. He realized how close he had come to death, and how much he owed this incredible animal. But he also knew something else. The game had changed. The hunters were now the hunted. The weight of truth was no longer his alone to carry. Reinforcements had arrived, and for the first time Silas Crow was no longer in control. The cabin floor thundered with the frantic steps of cornered rats. The calm, arrogant men who had been plotting the town's demise were now just panicked thieves. Clara Whitmore's voice rang out again, closer this time, laced with steel. "We're not leaving until we get some answers." "The rear door, now," Crow hissed. They were scrambling, shoving maps and tools into bags, their careful conspiracy collapsing around them. Through the cracks, Thomas saw their boots moving toward the back of the cabin. "What about the boy?" Dixon's voice was sharp with fear. "If he was here, he's gone now," Crow snapped. "We'll deal with him later. Move!" The back door creaked open, then slammed shut. The sound of their footsteps faded into the scrub brush outside. Silence fell inside the cabin. Thomas waited, his heart pounding, listening to the approaching murmur of the townsfolk. When he was sure the room was empty, he pushed against the loose floorboard. It lifted, and a shaft of dusty sunlight stabbed into the darkness. He scrambled out, his legs trembling. The dog followed, shaking the grime from its coat. The cabin was a wreck. Papers littered the floor. A broken vial had spilled its contents across the table. Thomas's eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything they might have missed. His gaze caught on a single sheet of paper, half hidden under the leg of the table. He knelt, his fingers shaking, and pulled it free. The words on the page made him forget how to breathe. Geological Survey. Signed Joseph Morrison, Surveyor. It was one of the original maps, but in the margins Morrison had written notes, a desperate, secret diary. Crow insists on delay, despite the suffering I see in town. His plan is to buy the land cheap before revealing the water. Morally indefensible. Thomas's eyes flew to the last line, scrawled at the very bottom of the page. If anything should happen to me, this document must reach the council. Crow does not act in the town's best interest. I fear what he is capable of. He clutched the paper to his chest. This wasn't just evidence. This was Joe Morrison's last will and testament. A voice speaking from beyond the grave. Outside, the townsfolk had reached the front porch. "We saw Dixon ride this way." Clara's voice was loud and angry. "After what happened to Joe Morrison all those years ago, we're not taking any chances." Thomas took a deep breath. He walked to the door, his knees weak but his purpose firm. Dust clung to his ragged shirt. Dirt streaked his face, but in his hand he held the truth. The dog trotted at his side, a silent, loyal guard. He stepped out into the light. The crowd fell silent. They stared at the orphan boy they had never truly seen before. Clara Whitmore's sharp eyes met his, and in them he didn't see pity. He saw a demand. He held up the paper. His voice was hoarse, but it carried in the still air. "I know why they were here," he said, "and I know what they've done." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Crow and Dixon had run, but in their haste they had left behind the one thing that could bring them down. And the boy they planned to murder was about to burn their empire to the ground. The cabin door swung open wide, and Clara Whitmore stepped inside, her eyes sweeping the room, missing nothing. Behind her, 3 grim-faced council members and a pair of ranch hands filed in, their boots stirring up the dust. Every single one of them stopped and stared at Thomas. The thin, dirty orphan boy standing beside the messy table, holding a crumpled piece of paper with a limping dog pressed against his leg. The scene spoke for itself. "This place has been used," one of the councilmen said, his voice a low growl. "And recently." Clara's gaze locked onto Thomas. It was not unkind, but it was relentless. "Thomas Talbot," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "did you see Silas Crow and Marshall Dixon here?" The silence in the room was absolute. 12 years of being invisible, of being worthless, washed over Thomas. He was the boy who lived on scraps. No one listened to him. No one cared. His survival instinct screamed at him to be quiet, to disappear back into the shadows. Let the powerful people sort it out. If he spoke now, Crow would hunt him down. Dixon still had a badge. They could crush him. But then he felt the dog's warm fur against his leg. He felt the crisp edges of Morrison's final words in his hand. He thought of the whole town, slowly dying of thirst, while 2 men grew rich on their suffering. Survival wasn't enough. Not anymore. Clara took a step closer. Her voice softened just a little. "Son, this is it. Right now. You decide if we keep choking on their lies, or if we finally get the truth." Thomas looked from the paper in his hand to the dog at his feet. The animal's intelligent eyes seemed to hold the weight of its lost master's trust. He took a shaky breath. His voice cracked, but it did not break. "I saw them," he said. "Crow and Dixon. They were right here, and this is why." He handed the document to Clara. His hand was perfectly steady. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt the weight of his own existence. He had chosen, he had spoken, and he might have just saved them all. Clara's hands tightened on the old survey as she read Morrison's notes aloud. Her voice, usually so steady, trembled with rage. "This aquifer is large enough to supply 3 towns our size. Crow insists on delay. His plan is to buy our land for nothing." The words landed like hammer blows in the silent cabin. The councilmen leaned forward, their faces hardening into masks of fury. "While our children went thirsty," Clara finished, her voice rising to a shout, "he hid this from us." Within an hour, the news was a wildfire tearing through Copper Ridge. The truth raced from house to house, from person to person, until the entire town was a single, angry mob gathered in the main street. When Marshal Dixon rode back into town, expecting to find a cowed and ignorant populace, he instead found a wall of furious eyes. Clara held up Morrison's survey. The surveyor's handwriting was a silent, damning witness. "You knew," a ranch hand yelled, spitting in the dust at Dixon's feet. "You knew, and you let him do it." Dixon's face went pale. His authority, once a shield, now felt like a cage. He tried to deny it, but the force of 100 angry voices beat him down. "Surrounded, broken," he confessed. He told them everything: the scheme, the payments, the lies. But when they went looking for Silas Crow, he was already a cloud of dust on the horizon. He had fled on his fastest horse, a coward running from the justice he could no longer buy. That night, something shifted in the soul of Copper Ridge. The lies were dead. The truth was out. And though the drought still held them in its grip for the first time in months, the people could see their real enemy clearly. The very next morning, the town moved as one. Guided by the precise coordinates on Joe Morrison's map, they gathered with shovels, picks, and anything that could break the hard-packed earth. They worked side by side, ranchers and storekeepers, men and women. For 3 days, under a relentless sun, they dug. Sweat dripped into the dust, hands blistered and bled. But no one stopped. Then, on the 3rd day, it happened. A low hiss from the bottom of the hole, a gurgle, and then with a roar, a column of clear, clean water erupted from the earth, shooting 30 feet into the air. A cheer went up, a sound of pure, unbridled joy that echoed off the hills. Children who had forgotten how to laugh splashed in the sudden mud, their faces lit with wonder. The water was life itself. Just days before, families had been packing their wagons, ready to abandon their homes. Now they talked of planting new fields. They talked of rebuilding. Hope, more powerful than any drought, washed over the town. And Thomas was no longer the invisible boy. He was a hero. He was invited to every dinner table, offered a job at the general store. His opinion was asked for. He was seen. The greatest change came from Clara Whitmore. She saw the courage in him. She saw the quiet strength. And one evening she didn't just offer him a plate of food. She offered him a room in her house. A home. For the first time in his 12 years, Thomas had a bed of his own. A family. The dog, who they named Morrison in honor of the man he'd been so loyal to, slept at the foot of that bed every night. A new marshal was elected. Dixon was sent to the territorial prison. Months later, word came that Silas Crow had been caught by federal lawmen, his stolen wealth confiscated. Justice, real and true, had finally come to Copper Ridge. The town council gave Thomas a new title, Deputy Surveyor. He helped map the aquifer, ensuring the water would be shared fairly, a resource for all, not a treasure for one. The drought had taught them a bitter lesson, but it had also forged them into something stronger. They learned that courage can be found in the most unlikely of places, and that sometimes the truth that saves everyone comes from the one person nobody ever thought to listen to. If you enjoyed this story of how a small voice can make a big difference, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice and unexpected heroes.